She arrived with stale bread, a broken suitcase, and nothing left to lose. They laughed at her, slammed the door in her face, and let her sleep in the dirt. 6 months later, she would stand in front of the entire county and destroy the most powerful man in Montana, with nothing but a pen, a ledger, and a mind they never saw coming. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. If it moves you, hit like and stay until the very end. You won't regret it. The summer Eliza Thornton came to Copper Creek. The town was in the middle of a drought so stubborn that even the old-timers had stopped making predictions about when it would break. The creek itself, the one the town was named after, the one painted on the sign at the south entrance with cheerful blue letters, had shrunk to a muddy trickle that smelled faintly of iron and dead grass. Cattle stood at fence lines looking confused. Gardens had given up. The air carried that particular flat, heavy heat that doesn't break at sundown, just sits on top of everything like a wool blanket that nobody asked for. Into this came Eliza. She came on foot, which was the first thing people noticed. Not in a wagon, not on horseback, not even with the weekly stage that dropped passengers and mail on Tuesdays. She walked in from the South Road on a Thursday afternoon in late August, with a canvas sack slung over one shoulder, a small leather satchel that had seen better days held in her right hand, and the careful, measured walk of someone who had learned not to spend energy she didn't have. She was a large woman, broad-shouldered, heavy-set, with the kind of body that people in Copper Creek felt perfectly comfortable forming opinions about before she had spoken a single word. Her dress was clean but faded at the elbows and hem. Her boots were good boots once, but that was probably 3 or 4 years ago, and they showed it. Her dark hair was pinned up against the heat, a few strands coming loose around her temples. She had a wide, square face, steady dark eyes, and an expression that gave nothing away. She walked down Main Street without stopping, took in the hardware store, the feed merchant, the 2-story saloon with the broken shutter on the upper left window, the barber shop, the post office, the dry goods store, the church at the far end with the cracked bell tower. She was making a map in her head, the way a person does when they don't know how long they're staying, but they've learned to know a place before they need to move through it in a hurry. At the far end of Main Street, just before the road bent north toward ranch country, there was a boarding house, Mercer's, with a painted board out front advertising rooms, meals, respectable tenants only. The paint on respectable was newer than the rest. Someone had gone back and touched it up recently. Eliza pushed open the front gate, walked up the path, and knocked. The woman who answered the door was Agnes Mercer, who had run the boarding house for 11 years and had, over that time, developed a set of opinions about people that she applied quickly and without much revision. She was a narrow woman, thin in the way that suggests discipline rather than deprivation, with small eyes that moved fast and a mouth that didn't move much when she wasn't using it. She looked at Eliza, looked at the sack, looked at the boots. Her eyes moved up and down once, and that was all the assessment she needed. "Full up," Agnes said. Eliza's expression didn't change. "I can see 3 empty windows from the street." Agnes's mouth pressed flat. "Full up with confirmed reservations." "I have coin." Eliza set the satchel down carefully on the porch step, opened it, and counted out exact change for a week's room and board. Not flashy, not begging, just clean and direct. "A week up front. I won't be any trouble." Agnes Mercer's eyes went to the coins and then back to Eliza's face. And the thing that moved across her expression in that moment was not complicated. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something smaller and uglier than cruelty. It was simple dismissal, the kind that doesn't even bother to be mean because it doesn't register the other person as someone worth being mean to. "I said full up," Agnes said. "I'd appreciate it if you moved along. You're blocking my step." And she closed the door. Not slammed. That would have been dramatic, would have implied Eliza had provoked something. Agnes simply closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a quiet, final sound that somehow managed to be worse than a slam. Eliza stood on the step for a moment. She picked up her satchel. She turned around, walked back down the path, and let herself out through the gate. She stood on the street with the afternoon sun hitting the side of her face and took a breath that she let out slowly through her nose. Then she looked up and down the street with those steady dark eyes, doing the math. She had enough coin for maybe 3 nights in a boarding house, assuming she found one willing to take her. She had not eaten since the morning. A half piece of stale bread she'd saved from 2 days ago, and a handful of dried apple from the bottom of her sack. She had no job, no contacts in this town, no letter of introduction from anyone. She had come to Copper Creek because it was the next town on the road, and the town before it had made her position very clear. She found a bench outside the post office and sat down, not in defeat, but in the practical manner of someone who needs to think and sees no point in doing it standing up. She set both bags between her feet. A dog trotted past and sniffed at her sack and kept going. A man came out of the dry goods store with a crate of something and didn't look at her. Two women crossed the street in front of her in the middle of a conversation they were having with each other and continued it right past her without a pause. In Copper Creek, Eliza Thornton was already invisible. She hadn't even been there 2 hours. Inside the saloon across the street, Gideon Cross was having an argument with his youngest brother about fence posts. This was not unusual. Gideon Cross, at 34, had been having arguments with his brothers about various things for as long as any of them could remember. And the arguments were rarely actually about the stated subject. They were about the fact that they were 5 grown men living and working in extremely close proximity on a ranch that their father had left them equally, which sounded fair and played out like a permanent negotiation over everything from grazing schedules to who left the gate to the south pasture unlatched again. There were 5 of them. Gideon, the oldest, who had his father's jaw and his mother's stubbornness, and ran the ranch with the kind of focused intensity that people sometimes mistook for coldness until they'd known him long enough. Then Seth, 31, the only brother who'd gotten any formal education and who sometimes let that be a problem. Then Caleb, 28, who was the hardest worker of the 5 but had a temper that flared fast and cooled fast, like a pan fire. Then Miles, 25, who was quieter than the rest and noticed things, which made him useful in ways his brothers didn't always appreciate. And finally Danner, 22, the youngest, who had strong opinions about fence posts and about many other things, and was currently expressing them at volume. "I'm telling you," Danner was saying, leaning both elbows on the bar with the entitled posture of a man who considers himself to be making an obvious point, "we can get them cheaper from Fallon's. I did the numbers." "Your numbers are wrong," Gideon said, without particular heat. He was sitting at a table near the window with a glass of water. He didn't drink much, which was an ongoing disappointment to the bartender, and a folded piece of paper that he'd been looking at with an expression that suggested the paper contained bad news. "My numbers are not wrong. You didn't factor in the delivery cost from Fallon's. Add that in and it's more expensive than buying local, and we don't have to wait 3 weeks for delivery." Gideon folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. "Buy local. It's not more expensive." "Danner!" This was Miles from the far end of the bar, not even looking up from the newspaper he was reading. "He already did the math. Drop it." Danner dropped it, the way people always eventually dropped things when all 4 of his brothers were, in various ways, arrayed against him. He turned back to his drink with the face of a man filing something under unresolved. It was Miles who looked out the window first. He did it the way he did everything, without announcing it, without making it a production. He just glanced up from the newspaper and something outside caught his eye, and he looked at it for a moment with that particular stillness he had. "Who's that?" he said. Gideon didn't look up. "Who's what?" "Woman, sitting outside the post office. Been there about 20 minutes. Caleb, who was standing near the window with a beer he'd been nursing for half an hour, turned to look. "Traveler, maybe. Waiting for someone." "She's not waiting for someone," Miles said. He folded his newspaper. "She's doing arithmetic." Gideon looked up at that because Miles had a specific tone he used when he thought something was worth paying attention to, and he'd used it just now. Gideon got up from his table and came to the window. Eliza was still on the bench. She had taken a small notebook out of her satchel and was writing in it. Not letters, from the look of it. Figures. A column of something. She was writing fast, her expression focused, one hand pressed flat on the page to keep it from moving in the hot afternoon breeze. "She came in on foot," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. He was putting together what he was looking at. "Knocked on Mercer's door about 40 minutes ago," Caleb said. "Saw it from the street. Agnes shut it in about 30 seconds. Seth, who had been quiet this whole time in the way that meant he was paying close attention, looked at his older brother. "You've got that look," he said. "What look?" "The look where you're about to do something Agnes Mercer would disapprove of." Gideon watched Eliza write in her notebook for another moment. She crossed something out, rewrote it, pressed her lips together, and looked at what she'd written with the expression of someone who doesn't like the answer but accepts it as accurate. Then she closed the notebook, put it back in her satchel, and looked up at the sky with the kind of face you make when you're recalculating your situation from the ground up. "I'm going to talk to her," Gideon said. "About what?" Danner said. "I don't know yet." Eliza saw him coming from across the street. She had, by that point, developed fairly reliable instincts about the different ways men approached a woman sitting alone, and she was already evaluating as he crossed the street. The way he moved, the set of his shoulders, whether he was making eye contact or avoiding it. He was making eye contact. He wasn't smiling, which she generally considered a good sign. Men who came at you smiling usually wanted something specific. He walked with the particular directness of someone who had decided to do a thing and was doing it without performing it. He was tall, lean in the way that comes from physical work rather than careful eating, with sun-darkened skin and brown hair that needed cutting. He was wearing working clothes, nothing put on for town. His boots were dusty. He had what she'd come to think of as rancher's hands, scarred at the knuckles, permanently roughened. He stopped a few feet away, which she appreciated. "Evening," he said. He had a low voice, not soft but controlled. "I'm Gideon Cross. My brothers and I run the Cross Ranch, about 8 miles north of town." "Eliza Thornton," she said. She didn't get up. She'd learned a long time ago not to pop up from a seat just because a man had arrived. It communicated a kind of anxiety she didn't feel and couldn't afford. He nodded, like that was the right answer. "You came in on foot today." "I did." "From the South Road?" "Yes." He looked at her with an assessing, direct expression that was somehow different from Agnes Mercer's look, though it was also frank. Agnes Mercer had looked at her and seen a problem to be avoided. Gideon Cross was looking at her and seemed to be working out something else. "Agnes Mercer turn you away?" he asked. Eliza considered lying, or softening it, or making a joke of it. She did none of those things. "Yes." He nodded again. "That's her habit." He said it without particular judgment, which surprised her. Not defending Agnes, not condemning her, just noting a fact. "Is there another boarding house in town?" Eliza asked. She asked it plainly because she needed to know, and there was no point in approaching the question sideways. "One," Gideon said. "Fenton's on the east side, but Fenton's costs more than Mercer's, and the food's worse." "Good to know." A brief silence. He didn't fill it immediately, which was unusual. Most people rush to fill silence with something. He just stood there for a moment looking at her, and she could tell he was working up to saying something that was, for him, somewhat unusual. "I've got a proposition," he said finally, "and I want to be straight with you about what it is, because I don't think straight talk is always the first thing people offer a woman in your position, and that seems wrong to me." Eliza looked at him steadily. "Go ahead." "The ranch needs help. Not just ranch work, the house side of things. Records, accounts, managing the household. My brothers and I are not organized men. We're good at cattle, we're good at the land, but the bookkeeping side of things has been—" He paused, apparently looking for the accurate word. "Bad," he settled on. "It's been bad for a few years now, and it's starting to matter." "You're offering me work. I'm offering you room, board, and wages. A private room in the ranch house. 3 meals a day. The wages are modest, but they're honest, and they'll be paid on time." Eliza was quiet for a moment. The sun had moved lower, and the heat was finally starting to soften at the edges. She looked at Gideon Cross and did the same calculation she always did when something seemed too direct to be genuine. She went looking for the thing underneath it, the angle, the expectation that wasn't being stated. She didn't find one. That didn't mean it wasn't there, only that she couldn't see it from here. "Why?" she said. He tilted his head slightly. "Why what?" "Why me? You don't know me. You've known I existed for about 15 minutes. I know you came in on foot. You had the coin for a boarding house and used it fairly, and you sat down and ran your numbers in a notebook instead of going to pieces or looking for someone to take care of you." He said it without any flourish, just observation. "That tells me something. It tells you I'm broke and pragmatic. It tells me you're somebody who handles what's in front of her," he said. "That's harder to find than people think." She looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was doing something to the street, turning the dust gold and making the whole dry, struggling little town look, briefly, like something it probably wasn't. "I want to see the room first," she said. He nodded. "That's fair. And I want it understood from the start that the arrangement is professional." "I didn't suggest otherwise." "No," she said. "You didn't. I'm saying it clearly anyway because I've learned that saying things clearly is better than assuming they're understood." Something moved in his expression. Not offense, not amusement exactly, more like recognition. Like she'd said something he agreed with. "All right," he said. "Fair enough." She stood up, picked up her bags, and looked at him directly. "I'll need to speak to your brothers." "They're across the street." She looked toward the saloon, then back at him. "Now?" "No better time," he said. The meeting with the Cross brothers was not what anyone involved would have described as smooth. Seth was polite in the careful way of someone who had learned politeness as a skill and was deploying it consciously. Caleb looked her over with frank suspicion. Not the small, dismissive kind Agnes Mercer had shown, but the direct, almost respectful kind, the kind that says, "I don't know you, and I'm not pretending otherwise." Miles, she noticed, had already been watching her. He was the one who'd spotted her from the window, she suspected, though she had no way to confirm it. He was quiet, but present in the way of someone who absorbs things. Danner was the most complicated. He was young enough to be uncertain how to behave, and old enough to cover that uncertainty with a kind of aggressive nonchalance that he wasn't quite pulling off. "You know accounts?" Seth asked. He'd put on the skeptical face of someone who has been burned by bad information before. "I know accounts," Eliza said. "I ran the books for my family's farm from the age of 14 until—" She stopped. "For several years. I can show you what I know if you want me to demonstrate it. I don't mind a test." "What happened to the farm?" Caleb asked. Blunt, but not unkind. "That's a longer story," she said, "and I'll tell it when I know you better. What I can tell you right now is that I'm capable, I'm honest, and I won't be a problem." Caleb held her gaze for a moment, then looked at Gideon with an expression that communicated something between the two of them, some private ledger of assessment that she wasn't privy to. Then he looked back at her. "You cook?" he asked. "I cook," she said. "Better than Seth?" "Caleb," Seth said. "It's a real question." Caleb spread his hands. "Seth made biscuits last Sunday that I could have shot a horse with." "I make acceptable biscuits," Eliza said. Caleb nodded as if this were valuable information. "She's fine," he said to Gideon. Miles said nothing, which she was starting to understand was approximately the same as approval from him. Danner was the last holdout. He'd been leaning against the bar through this whole exchange with his arms crossed and the particular expression of a young man who wants to seem unmoved by things. "What if you decide to leave in 2 weeks?" he said. "We do all this, and you're gone." Eliza looked at him. He was younger than she'd initially thought. There was something around his eyes that was still, despite the attitude, the eyes of someone who hadn't been disappointed enough times to stop expecting things. "Then I'll leave in 2 weeks," she said. "I can't promise you I'll be there forever. I can promise you I'll be honest with you about where I'm at. That's all anyone can promise." Danner chewed on this. "What's in it for you?" "A room," she said. "A meal. A place to work that isn't a ditch." She kept her voice even. "That's enough." Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but the dropping of a pretense. "Okay," he said quietly, like he hadn't quite meant to say it out loud. They loaded her bags into the back of the wagon. Gideon drove, and she sat on the bench beside him while his brothers followed behind in a second wagon that had apparently been in town for supplies. The road north climbed out of the valley and curved through low hills with sparse pine and scrub grass. The heat was finally breaking as the sun dropped, and the air had taken on that particular quality. It gets in the high plains at dusk, cleaner and wider, like someone had opened a window in the sky. Neither Gideon nor Eliza spoke much. He pointed out landmarks once or twice, the far edge of the cross range, the ridge where a neighbor's fence line ran. Practical information, the kind a person would need to know. She absorbed it and asked 2 questions, both of them practical. "The accounts," she said at one point. "You said they've been poorly managed. How poorly?" He was quiet for a moment, which told her something. "We've had money leaving the ranch for the last 2 years that I can't fully account for," he said. "Not huge amounts, but steady. You think someone's stealing? I think something is wrong, he said carefully. I don't like making accusations I can't support. Do you have the records? All of them? Whatever exists? They're in the ranch office, such as they are. I'll start there, she said. He glanced sideways at her. You don't want to settle in first? I want to see what I'm dealing with, she said. I can settle in after. He looked back at the road, and she saw the corner of his mouth move slightly. Not quite a smile, more like the acknowledgement of something. All right, he said. The Cross Ranch sat in a shallow valley between two long ridges, positioned to catch whatever breeze came through and to have a natural windbreak to the north for winter. It was not a grand ranch. There were working ranches in Montana by that time that had grown into something resembling small kingdoms, but it was solid, substantial. A main house of 2 stories, timber and stone, with a long porch that ran the full front length. A barn of serious size. A separate bunkhouse where the ranch hands, 3 of them, lived and slept. Corrals, stables, outbuildings. Everything a little worn, a little tired, in the way of places where people have been working hard for a long time and putting all their attention into the work and not much into the appearance of the work. Eliza got down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at it. It was, she thought, a real place, not a performance of a place. The kind of place that had history in it and problems in it and probably a fair amount of stubbornness in it. She had lived in real places before. She understood them. Come on, Gideon said. I'll show you the room. The room was on the 2nd floor, at the east end of the hall, with a window that looked out over the corrals and beyond them the lower pastures that ran toward the ridge. It contained a bed with a solid frame, a dresser with 3 drawers, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a small desk under the window, and a chair. The floor was bare board. The window had curtains, faded blue, mismatched to everything else in the room, which suggested they'd been put up by someone who was trying, which Eliza found more touching than matching curtains would have been. It's good, she said, setting her bags down. Gideon was in the doorway. There's a basin downstairs if you want to clean up. Supper's in about an hour. Danner's turn to cook, so I can't promise anything. I said I'd cook. You just got here. I'm aware, she said, but if Danner's cooking is anything like his fence post opinions, I'd rather be useful. He looked at her. You heard that. I was sitting outside the saloon. The window was open. He was quiet for a moment, and this time the corner of his mouth went a little further. Not a full smile. She had the sense that full smiles were not something Gideon Cross deployed casually, but something. The kitchen's downstairs to the left, he said. There's a pantry through the back door. Whatever's in there, use it. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and turned to go. Gideon. He stopped, turned back. Why did you come across the street? She said. Really, you could have left me alone. He held her gaze for a moment, and she had the sense he was deciding whether to give her the short answer or the real one. My father built this ranch, he said. He had nothing when he started. Came here with nothing, worked for someone else for 7 years before he had enough to buy this land. He paused. He told us, when we were kids, there are 2 kinds of people. The ones who got here already, and the ones who are still trying to get here. He said the worst thing you can do is forget which one you used to be. He looked at her steadily. I hadn't forgotten. He turned and walked down the hall, and she heard his boots on the stairs, and then she was alone in the room that was, for the moment, hers. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window. Outside, the last of the light was going amber over the pastures. The cattle were moving, slow shapes in the distance. Somewhere in the barn, a horse was making the soft percussive sound of a horse who has been fed and is content. The air coming through the window was cooler now, carrying the smell of dry grass and something faintly mineral, the particular smell of Montana open country at the end of the day. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and looked at the room and breathed. She had been in a lot of temporary places. She knew how to not get attached to rooms, to not start thinking of things as hers, because the moment you started thinking of things as yours was the moment losing them cost you something. She knew the discipline of it, had practiced it for years, had gotten very good at keeping herself portable in the ways that mattered. But the room was quiet, the bed was solid, and somewhere downstairs a kitchen was waiting. She was hungry, she was tired. She had nowhere to be in the morning except here. She got up, smoothed her dress, checked her face in the small mirror above the washstand, and went downstairs to cook. Supper that night was a revelation to the Cross brothers. Not because Eliza did anything elaborate, but because she made what was available into something that actually tasted like food. She found dried beans in the pantry, a ham hock, onions, cornmeal, lard, and the tail end of what had once been a cured side of pork. She made ham and bean soup and cornbread, both from scratch, in about 45 minutes, moving through the kitchen with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has cooked for people who needed feeding and knew the difference between cooking and performing. The brothers came in from various corners of the ranch and settled around the long table in the dining room, which, Eliza had noticed on her way through, had a film of dust on the sideboard and a stack of papers that had been accumulating in the corner until they'd achieved a kind of geological permanence. And there was a silence when the food arrived that she recognized as the silence of men who had been eating each other's cooking for too long. "Holy," Danner started. "Don't," Seth said. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying. Eat your soup." Miles ate without comment, which was, she was learning, his version of a standing ovation. Caleb ate, looked up at her from across the table, and said, "You do this every night, and I will personally make sure Danner stops leaving the south gate unlatched." "That was one time," Danner said. "It was 4 times. "Can we not?" Gideon said mildly. "I'm happy to cook if that's useful," Eliza said. "But I want to be clear it's not the only thing I'm here to do." "No one said it was," Gideon said. "I know." She looked around the table at all 5 of them. "I'll start on the accounts tomorrow morning. I'd like to go through everything that exists. Ledgers, receipts, contracts, whatever you have. All of it." "That's a lot," Seth said cautiously. "I imagine it is," she said. "Is there something in it you don't want me to see?" Seth blinked. "No." "Then it's just work," she said. "I'll start in the morning." Danner looked at Gideon with an expression that seemed to say something in the neighborhood of, "Where did you find her?" But Gideon was looking at his soup, and his expression gave nothing away. She started in the morning. The ranch office was a small room off the front hallway that had, at some point in the past, been organized by someone who cared about organization. There were shelves along 2 walls with labeled spaces, supply orders, land records, cattle tallies, payment ledgers, correspondence. The labels were still there. The materials were not particularly in the spaces the labels suggested they should be. Receipts had migrated into ledger books. Land records were in 2 different places. There were multiple years where the ledger entries simply stopped for months at a time and then resumed, without explanation or reconciliation. Eliza pulled everything off the shelves, made 3 stacks on the desk and 2 on the floor, and began. She worked for 6 hours that first day, stopping only once to drink water and once to step outside for 10 minutes because her eyes were starting to blur from close reading. By early afternoon, she had organized everything by type and date. By evening, she had reconciled 2 years of incomplete ledger entries. By the time she made supper that night, she had found the first irregularity. It was small. Small enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it, and small enough that you might dismiss it as a recording error if you saw it once. But it wasn't once. It was a pattern, a recurring charge labeled with a supplier name she'd have to check, appearing in the supply ledger at irregular intervals for amounts that varied just enough to avoid a pattern, but not enough to hide one from someone looking at the whole picture at once. She didn't say anything that night. She kept her expression neutral through supper, listened to the brothers argue about the east fence line, and went to bed. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about patterns, and about what you do when you find one, and about the particular weight of knowing something and not yet knowing enough. In the morning, she would know more. That was the thing about records. They didn't lie. They couldn't. They just waited for someone patient enough to read them. Eliza Thornton had been many things in her life. A farmer's daughter, a drifter, a woman judged before she'd opened her mouth. But she had always been patient, and she was very, very good at reading. Outside the window, the Montana sky was moving into dawn, gray and wide and flat, and the first sounds of the ranch coming awake were rising up from the yard below. Boots on gravel, the distant call of a crow, the low sound of cattle. The smell of dust and grass came in through the gap in the curtains. She pressed her hands flat on the quilt, the same way she'd pressed them on her knees the night before on the bed. Tomorrow, she'd know more. Yeats. The summer drought broke 3 weeks after Eliza arrived. By then, she had found 12 irregularities in the ranch's accounts, spanning 4 years. She had not yet told Gideon what she suspected. She was still building the case the way she'd built everything in her life, methodically, piece by piece, making absolutely certain before she spoke. She had learned, somewhere along the way, that the most powerful thing in the world was not a raised voice or a clenched fist. It was a ledger, properly kept in the hands of someone who understood what it meant. The rain came on a Tuesday. It started the way drought-breaking rain always starts in that country. Not gently, not with warning, but all at once, like the sky had been holding its breath for 3 weeks and finally exhaled. One moment the air was dry and brittle, and the next the yard was mud, and the corrals were rivers, and the brothers were running in from the fields with their hats pulled down and their shirts soaked through before they'd taken 10 steps. Eliza was in the office when it started. She heard the first crack of thunder somewhere to the north, felt the pressure drop in her ears, and then the rain hit the roof like something thrown rather than fallen. She got up and closed the window. The papers, she thought first, always the papers, and then stood for a moment listening to it hammer down on the shingles above her head, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could precisely remember. Relief. Not her own. The land's. The particular relief of something that has been surviving on not enough, and is finally getting what it needs. She sat back down and returned to the ledger. She had been at the accounts for 3 weeks by then, and she had stopped thinking of them as chaotic. Chaos implies randomness. What she was looking at was not random. It had a shape to it. Once you knew where to look, the way a figure hidden in a drawing has a shape once your eyes find the right angle. And Eliza's eyes had found the angle on day 4. The supplier name was Renner and Associates. It appeared first in a ledger from 4 years back. A modest entry, $7.60 for sundry equipment maintenance, authorized by a signature she didn't recognize and had not yet placed. It appeared again 6 weeks later. Then again. The amounts varied between $6 and $22, never large enough to require Gideon's personal sign-off under the ranch's own informal accounting rules, always just below the threshold that would have prompted a second look. Someone had understood exactly where that threshold was. Over 4 years, Renner and Associates had collected $341 from the Cross Ranch for sundry equipment maintenance, for which there was not a single corresponding record of work performed, tools delivered, or service rendered. $341 was not a fortune, but it was real money, say, money that should have gone toward fencing repairs, or a new harness set, or any of the dozen small necessities that the brothers had been putting off because the budget always seemed just barely tight enough to make the decision difficult. That tightness was not accidental. On the morning of day 18, she'd found the second thread. This one was subtler. Not a false supplier, but a recurring discrepancy between the stated purchase price of cattle feed and what the brothers had actually paid, with the difference skimmed off in rounding errors that a casual reader would never question. 2 cents here, 8 cents there, $1.43 on a large order. Small numbers, extremely consistent pattern. She put the 2 threads side by side in her notebook, the Renner entries and the feed discrepancies, and looked at them for a long time. Then she started looking for a third. She found it on day 20 in a stack of correspondence that had been shoved in a box under the desk and apparently not touched in 2 years. It was a letter, typed, from a land surveying company, addressed to Gideon but clearly never opened. The envelope had been slit, not by Gideon, she was increasingly certain, and then tucked back into the pile, slit side down. The letter inside informed Gideon Cross that the eastern water easement his father had registered in 1871 was still fully valid and had been confirmed in the most recent county land review. Routine notification, nothing alarming on its face, except that 3 months after that letter was written and intercepted, the Cross brothers had received a different letter. She found it in another box, this one opened and noted in Gideon's own handwriting, informing them that the eastern water easement was under review and that its status was unclear pending a county determination. They had apparently spent the following year in a low-level anxiety about the water rights, paying 2 separate legal consultations to confirm they were in the clear, which they had always been in the clear. Someone had wanted them worried, distracted, and spending money on lawyers. She sat back in the office chair and listened to the rain and thought about what kind of person does a thing like that. Not a petty thief. A petty thief just takes the money, and leaves. This was something more patient, more deliberate, someone who wanted the Cross Ranch slowly undermined, its resources quietly depleted, its owners kept off balance and slightly anxious, never quite failing but never quite stable either. That kind of long game meant someone who expected to profit from it eventually, not in small receipts, but in something larger. She needed to know who Renner and Associates actually was. She needed to know who had access to this office 4 years ago and who had been handling the mail. And she needed to decide when to tell Gideon. She was still working through the last question when the door to the office opened and Caleb came in, dripping from the rain, tracking mud, pulling off his hat and shaking it in a way that distributed water across a meaningful portion of the room. "Sorry," he said, noticing her expression. He stopped shaking the hat. "You find something?" She looked at him. Of the 4 brothers, Caleb was the one she'd been least sure of in the beginning. His directness read as aggression until you understood it was just the way he was wired, that he said what he thought because it had never occurred to him to do otherwise, and that this made him, in practice, one of the more trustworthy people she'd met in recent years. "Sit down," she said. He sat, still dripping slightly, with the focused expression of a man who can tell that what he's about to hear is going to require him to pay attention. She walked him through it. Not all of it. She kept the 3rd thread, the letter, for when she had the full picture. But she laid out the Renner charges and the feed discrepancies clearly, showing him the ledger entries, the dates, the pattern. She did it the way she always did things, straightforwardly, without drama, letting the numbers do what numbers do. Caleb said nothing for a long time. He looked at the ledger pages she'd set in front of him. He had his hat between his hands and he was turning it slowly, which she had come to understand was what he did when he was thinking hard. $341, he said finally. Over 4 years. Who is Renner and Associates? I don't know yet. That's the next thing I need to find out. He looked up at her. You think someone on the ranch is involved? I don't know that either, she said carefully. What I know is that someone with access to this office and this mail was involved. I'm not ready to say more than that. He set his hat on the desk and rubbed his face with both hands, a rough, unselfconscious gesture that was very Caleb. Gideon needs to know, he said. Yes, she said, tonight. You want me there? She thought about it. She thought about Gideon's face, about the controlled way he carried himself, about the particular way his jaw had tightened when she'd first asked him about the irregular charges 3 weeks ago. He knew something was wrong. He'd known for a while. Finding out that the knowing had been justified was not going to be an easy moment for him. Not tonight, she said. I'll talk to him. Caleb nodded, looking at her steadily. You know, he said, when Gideon brought you here, I didn't know what I thought, to be honest. I thought maybe he'd done something sentimental. He did do something sentimental, Eliza said. Maybe. He stood up, picked up his hat. But you're not, are you? Sentimental. She considered this. Not about numbers, she said. He almost smiled. Good, he said, and went back out into the rain. She told Gideon that evening after supper when the other brothers had dispersed in their usual directions. Danner to the bunkhouse to play cards with the ranch hands, Seth to his room with a book, Miles to the barn on some self-assigned errand that he'd mentioned and then not elaborated on. She knocked on the office door, where Gideon had retreated with his own pile of correspondence. You have a minute? She said. He set his papers down and turned to face her, and she saw immediately that he'd been expecting this. Not the specific content, but the tone, the knocking instead of just speaking, the particular way she was standing in the doorway. He'd known, probably since the first week, that she was going to find something. She closed the door behind her and laid it out. She showed him the ledger. She showed him the Renner entries, each one marked with a small pencil tick, the dates and amounts in her neat columns beside them. She showed him the feed discrepancies. She told him about the intercepted letter and put it on the desk in front of him, open, the surveying company's letterhead visible. He read it twice. She watched his face go through several things, confusion, recognition, and then a kind of quiet, contained fury that was much more alarming than a loud one would have been. This letter, he said. His voice was level. It was opened. Yes. And then put back. Yes. Someone wanted you not to see it. He set it down with a deliberate care that cost him something. She could see it costing him. "The Renner charges," he said. "Who authorized them?" "The signatures are inconsistent. Some look like an older hand. One looks like it might be a deliberate attempt to mimic your father's signature." She paused. "I can't be certain of that last part. You'd know your father's signature better than I would." He pulled the ledger toward him and looked at the entry she indicated. His expression did something complicated. "That's not my father's hand," he said quietly. "No," she said. "I didn't think so." He was silent for a moment. The rain had eased to a steady drum on the roof, and outside the window the yard was full of the sound of running water, all the dry creek beds briefly alive again. "Who has access to this office?" she asked. "Family. Ranch hands come in and out." He paused. "We've had a bookkeeper, part-time, a man named Aldous Pruitt, who comes in twice a month from town. Has for about 6 years." "Does he handle the mail?" Gideon was quiet for a moment. That was one moment too long. "Sometimes," he said, "when I'm out on the land and things back up." The silence between them had weight to it now. "I'm not saying it's him," Eliza said carefully. "I'm saying he has access and that it's somewhere to start. I need to find out who Renner and Associates is. Do you have a copy of the county business registry or someone who could pull it?" "Seth might know," he said. "He's got contacts with the county recorder's office from when we filed the water easement." He stopped. "The water easement that was apparently never in question." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He looked at the letter again. She watched him put the pieces together. The anxiety of the previous year, the legal consultations, the money spent reassuring themselves of something that never needed reassuring. The time spent distracted. She watched him understand that it had been designed to distract them. "Who benefits from this ranch being smaller?" she said. "Weaker. Perpetually slightly off balance." He looked up at her. He had already been thinking about this. She could see it. "There's one obvious answer," he said. "Tell me." "Vincent Blackwell." She had heard the name once since arriving. Miles had mentioned it in passing, something about a land deal that hadn't gone the way the Cross family had hoped 3 years back. "Who is he?" "He's the largest private landowner in this county," Gideon said. "Has been for about 10 years since he came down from Helena with money that nobody quite knows the origin of. He's been buying up land and water rights along the valley for most of that time. Quietly, or not so quietly, depending on who you ask." He paused. "He's made us 2 offers on the eastern water easement. We've turned them both down." "How did he take that?" "Politely," Gideon said. "Which is worse. What does he want the eastern easement for?" "It's the only water access for the lower valley that isn't already under his control. If he had it, he'd control the water supply for 7 different ranch families in this region. He'd be able to set terms." Eliza looked at the letter. She looked at the ledger. She thought about patience, about long games, about the kind of man who builds a plan in 4-year increments. "Has he ever met me?" she said. Gideon frowned slightly at the question. "You've been here 3 weeks. You've hardly been into town." "No," she said. "I know, but he'll know I'm here. A town like Copper Creek. Someone new at the Cross Ranch. That'll have been talked about." "Probably," Gideon said slowly. "Why does it matter?" She thought about how to say what she was thinking, which was this: that she had spent years being the kind of person powerful men overlooked, and she had learned to use that the way you use any tool. She was a large, poorly dressed woman who had arrived in town with nothing and been turned away from a boarding house. The story of that had already traveled. To a man like Blackwell, careful, calculating, accustomed to categorizing threats, she would not read as a threat. She would read as an irrelevance. "It might not matter at all," she said. "I just want to know what I'm walking into before I finish building the picture." He studied her for a moment. "You think this connects to Blackwell?" "I think it might. I don't have enough to say yet." She began gathering the papers back into their organized piles. "Give me a week. I want to find out what Renner and Associates is, and I want to look at the county land filings for the past 5 years. Do you have those?" "Some of them. The rest would be at the county recorder's office." "Can you get them?" "Seth can," he said. "I'll ask him tomorrow." She nodded. "One more thing." She stopped with the papers in her hand and looked at him directly, the way she'd learned to do when she needed someone to understand that she wasn't softening something. "Whoever set this up, they've been doing it for 4 years, minimum. That means they were patient, and they're going to notice when the money stops moving the way it's been moving. When I close those accounts and the renter charges stop going through, someone is going to know something changed. He held her gaze. You think they'll push back? I think a careful person who's been running a 4-year plan doesn't just walk away when the small part stops working, she said. Yes, I think they'll push back. He was quiet for a moment, and she let the quiet sit. All right, he said. Then we move carefully. We move carefully, she agreed. She said goodnight and went upstairs, and he sat alone in the office with the rain on the roof and the ledger open in front of him, and he sat there for a long time. Seth pulled the county records within 3 days. He had a contact at the recorder's office, a former classmate who had gone into civic administration and who Seth could reach without raising flags by using the ordinary pretext of a water rights confirmation. The records arrived by mail in a large packet, and Eliza took them into the office and did not come out for most of the day. Renner and Associates turned out to be a business registered in Billings in 1883, listing a Mr. P.C. Renner as principal. There was no physical address on file beyond a postal box. The business category was listed as General Services and Consultation, which was the 19th century equivalent of saying nothing at all. The registration had been filed by a legal office in Billings, a firm called Harwick & Sons, that also appeared when Eliza went looking in 3 other county registrations connected to land transactions that had, in each case, resulted in the consolidation of water rights in the Copper Creek Valley under a single owner. The single owner in each case was not listed by name. It was listed as the Meridian Land and Water Company. It took Eliza until the second night of reading to confirm what she had started suspecting by afternoon. The Meridian Land and Water Company's principal shareholder, listed in a Helena corporate filing from 1879, was Vincent Blackwell. She put the documents in order and held them in her hands and sat with the weight of what she was looking at. This was not opportunistic theft. This was architecture. Blackwell, or someone working carefully on his behalf, had set up a network of paper companies and proxy agents that allowed him to quietly drain resources from competing ranch properties, simultaneously keep those properties anxious and distracted about their land rights, and position himself to make an attractive purchase offer when those properties were weakened enough. The Cross Ranch was not the only one. Looking at the land transaction records Seth had pulled, she could see at least 4 other ranch properties in the valley that showed similar patterns: a slow erosion of security, a recurring low-grade financial drain, a legal question introduced at a strategic moment. 4 ranch families, all of them probably believing their troubles were their own, not understanding they were all pieces of the same operation. She sat with that for a long time. When she finally came out of the office, it was past 9 in the evening. The kitchen was quiet. Supper had come and gone without her, and someone had left a covered plate on the stove with a note in Danner's handwriting that said, "You forgot to eat, genius." And most of the house was dark. But there was light under the door of the sitting room, and when she pushed it open, she found all 4 brothers there, which did not happen often. Gideon was reading. Seth was writing something at the side table. Caleb was sharpening a knife with the focused, rhythmic attention he gave to physical tasks. Miles was looking at the fire. They all looked up when she came in. "Sit down," she said. She laid the documents on the table. Not all of them, but the critical chain: the Renner registration, the Harwick & Sons connection, the Meridian Land and Water Company filing, the shareholder listing. She walked them through it. The room was very quiet while she talked. The fire made its sounds. Caleb stopped sharpening the knife around the point where the Meridian connection became clear, and he set it down carefully on the arm of his chair like he was afraid of what his hands might do if they were holding something. Danner, who had come in from the bunkhouse at some point in the last hour and was sitting on the floor near the door with his back to the wall, said nothing at all through the whole presentation, which was so unlike him that it registered as its own kind of statement. "How long?" Seth said when she finished. His voice was quiet and precise. "How long has this been running?" 4 years that I can document clearly. Possibly longer. Some of the earlier records are incomplete, and I can't reconstruct them with confidence. 4 years, Caleb said. He said it to the fire. "The other ranches," Miles said. He had turned from the fire and was looking at her with those observant eyes. "You said 4 others show similar patterns." "Yes. I can't say for certain without seeing their records, but the land transaction timeline is consistent with the same operation. Those families don't know, he said. I don't think so, she said. No. Miles looked at Gideon. Gideon had been sitting forward through most of this with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, looking at the documents. He looked up now, and his face was the face of a man who has received news that confirms the worst version of something he'd been hoping was just bad luck, and is in the process of deciding what to do with that. We need to go to the county, Seth said. We need to go carefully, Eliza said. Blackwell has money and legal resources. If we go to the county with what I have right now, the best outcome is an inquiry that drags on for years while his lawyers make the evidence look circumstantial. Worse outcome, he knows we're moving against him, and he accelerates whatever he's planning next. What is he planning next? Danner said from the floor. The first thing he'd said. Everyone looked at him, then back at Eliza. I don't know yet, she said. But a man who's been running a 4-year preparatory campaign doesn't do it for small stakes. He wants the water easement. He probably wants this ranch, or enough of it to control the water. He's going to make a move at some point, and it's going to be bigger than paper companies and intercepted letters. So we wait? Caleb said. The word came out with edges. We prepare, she said. We document everything we have completely and correctly, so that when the time comes, the case is undeniable. We do not tip our hand before we're ready. She paused. And we should warn the other ranch families. Carefully. They deserve to know what's been happening to them. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You think he knows about you? He said. About what you found? Not yet, she said. I think he knows a woman came to the ranch and has been doing the books. I think that reads as normal household management to someone watching from a distance. She set her hands flat on the table. That window is going to close. When the renter charges stop going through and the accounts close the holes, someone in his operation is going to notice. We have some time. Not a lot. How much? Seth asked. Weeks, she said. Maybe less. The fire popped. Outside, the rain had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the night was the clean, washed kind that comes after a long drought finally breaks. Everything smelling of wet earth, the sky clearing to show stars. All right, Gideon said. He stood up, unfolding to his full height with the measured movement of a man who has made a decision. Eliza, finish the documentation. Take whatever time you need and whatever help you need from Seth on the legal side. He looked at Caleb. Not a word to anyone in town until she says it's time. He looked at Miles. I need you to quietly reach out to the Henderson Ranch and the Potters. Old friendships, nothing official. See if they're willing to talk. He looked at Danner, who had gotten up from the floor at some point. You'll ride out tomorrow and check the east fence line. All of it. I want to know our land exactly. Danner nodded. Something in his face had changed over the course of the evening. The last of the nonchalance had gone out of it, replaced by something steadier. One more thing, Gideon said. He was looking at Eliza. You did this. You found it. Whatever happens next, that's yours. She looked at him. She felt, unexpectedly, the specific discomfort of being acknowledged, of having someone name what she'd done plainly and mean it. She had been so long in the habit of working invisibly, of being the person whose contributions vanished into the outcome without a name on them, that she didn't quite know what to do with the directness of it. I didn't do anything except read, she said. Nobody read those books for 4 years, he said. You did it in 3 weeks. She didn't answer. She gathered the documents back into their careful stack and said goodnight, and went back to the office, and sat at the desk in the dark for a while before she lit the lamp and went back to work. There was still more to find. She could feel it, the way you feel the shape of something in a box before you open it, the weight of what the records hadn't yet shown her, the gaps that still needed filling, the questions that each answer opened up. Outside the window, the Montana night was wide and clear and dark, and the wet land smelled like possibility, the way it does after rain. She opened the next ledger. The window closed faster than Eliza had predicted. It was Miles who brought the first sign, 11 days after the sitting room meeting. He came in from his quiet errand, the one that had taken him to the Henderson Ranch and then to the Potters, both visits dressed as neighborly calls, nothing official. And he found Eliza in the kitchen rather than the office, because she had learned that the kitchen was where she thought best, The physical work of cooking, giving her hands something to do while her mind ran its circuits. He sat down at the table without being invited, which was unusual for Miles, and she turned from the stove and looked at him. "Blackwell's been in town," he said. She set the spoon down on the rest. "When?" 3 days ago, according to Walt Henderson. Stayed 2 nights at the saloon's guest rooms, the good ones, upstairs. Had meetings." Miles folded his hands on the table. Walt didn't know who with, but he said Blackwell asked about the Cross Ranch. Specifically. He paused. Specifically asked if there was anyone new working out here. Eliza was quiet for a moment. She picked the spoon back up and stirred the pot, not because it needed stirring, but because she needed the second to think. "What did Walt tell him?" "Walt doesn't know enough to tell him anything useful, but someone in town does." "Agnes Mercer," she said. Miles looked at her. Probably Agnes Mercer, who had seen Eliza arrive, who had watched her cross the street and get into a wagon with Gideon Cross, who had, in Eliza's 3 weeks of occasional trips to town for supplies, looked at her with the particular expression of a woman storing observations. "Did the Henderson visit help?" she asked. "Walt, is he open to talking?" "Walt Henderson is a cautious man," Miles said. He listened. He didn't commit to anything, but he's been having his own troubles with supplier charges he can't account for, and when I pointed out the pattern without telling him everything, I could see it land. He looked at his hands. "The Potters are angrier. Older couple. They've been ranching that land for 30 years. They've lost 2 pasture parcels in the last 18 months to what they thought were legitimate debt proceedings. Agnes Potter cried when I visited. She thought it was their own mismanagement." Eliza turned back to the stove. The soup was ready, but she left it on the low flame. "It wasn't their mismanagement." "No," Miles said. "It wasn't." He stood up. "Blackwell's coming back to town at the end of the month for the County Water Commission meeting. Walt Henderson heard that too." She turned to face him fully. "The Water Commission meets monthly?" "First Thursday of the month, usually routine. Maintenance reports, seasonal allocation, but Blackwell apparently requested agenda time." "For what?" "Unspecified matter of regional water access," Miles said, quoting the tone of someone who has memorized a phrase. "That's what Walt was told." Eliza stood very still for a moment. Then she walked to the door. "Tell Gideon," she said, "tonight, and tell him I need 2 more weeks." "Do you have 2 more weeks?" She thought about the stack of county land filings still on her desk. She thought about the chain she'd been building. Renner to Harwick, to Meridian to Blackwell. And the 3 links she still needed to make it legally airtight rather than merely persuasive. She thought about Agnes Potter crying at her own kitchen table, believing her family had failed. "I'll make 2 weeks," she said. She worked like she had not worked since the early weeks on her family's farm, when the harvest was coming and there was never enough time, and the only answer was to stop sleeping more than you absolutely had to. She was at the desk before the ranch woke, and still there when the house went quiet at night. Seth brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked and reviewed her legal interpretations in the evenings, with the careful precision of a man who understood that imprecision, in this context, was the same as failure. Caleb, in his undemonstrative way, started leaving food on the corner of the desk. Not elaborate. A biscuit, a slice of cold meat, an apple from the tree near the barn. She found these offerings without comment and ate them without comment, and they both understood this as a form of conversation. Danner was the one who surprised her. He came to the office door on the 5th day of her intensive push, knocked, which he had not done before, had previously just pushed the door open, and stood in the frame looking like he wanted to say something he hadn't yet figured out how to say. "What is it?" she said without looking up. "I've been thinking," he said, "about Aldous Pruitt." She looked up then. Pruitt, the part-time bookkeeper who had access to the office, who handled the mail when Gideon was out. She had not yet been able to connect him to the Renner entries directly, only circumstantially. "What about him?" "He drinks at the saloon on Saturday nights," Danner said. "I've known him for years. He's a talker when he drinks." He was looking at the floor in a way that was not quite embarrassment, but adjacent to it. "I could go in, not asking about anything specific, just talking." She studied him. He was 22, with his brother's directness and none of their patience, and he had the quality of someone who wanted badly to be useful in a situation where his particular set of skills, physical work, fast decisions, confronting things head-on, weren't what was needed. And here he was, offering something more subtle. "You can't tip your hand," she said. "I know." "If he realizes you're fishing—" "I said I know," he said, with a flash of the old irritation. Then, quieter. "I'm not stupid. I just act like it sometimes." She held his gaze for a moment. "All right," she said. "Don't push. Let him talk. If he doesn't give you anything, you walk away. The most important thing is that he doesn't know we're looking at him." Danner nodded. "Saturday," he said. He came back from town on Saturday night with something useful and one split knuckle, the second of which he declined to explain, and she declined to ask about. What he'd gotten from Pruitt, over 2 beers, in the casual way of men who've known each other across a bar for years, was a name. Not Blackwell's name, not Harwick's. A smaller name, a middleman. A man called Sutter who worked as a land agent out of a rented office near the county recorder's, and who had, according to Pruitt's loose-tongued account, a very interesting way of making sure things got recorded in the right order. Pruitt hadn't explained what that meant. He'd laughed about it, which told Eliza that he was in on it, at least peripherally. Nobody laughs that way about something they're not part of. She had Seth pull Sutter's filing history from the county records the next day. It took him most of Monday, and he came back tight-lipped with a stack of papers and the look of a man who is freshly angry. "Sutter filed the adverse claim on the Potter's pasture parcels," Seth said, putting the papers on her desk. "Both of them, acting as agent for a holding company called Blue Ridge Land." He sat down. "Blue Ridge Land is registered through Harwick and Sons." Eliza looked at the papers. The chain was almost complete now. Blackwell to Meridian to Harwick to Blue Ridge to Sutter to the Potter's land. And branching off Harwick, the renter charges feeding quietly into the Cross Ranch accounts for 4 years. One legal firm, multiple instruments, one set of hands moving the pieces. "Can we prove Blackwell controls Meridian?" she said. "Sheet that. The Helena corporate filing lists him," Seth said. "It's public record. His lawyers will argue that he's a passive investor with no knowledge of subsidiaries, but the filing is there." "Is that enough?" Seth looked at her honestly. "It depends on the forum," he said. "In a civil court, probably not. Not without more. In a county hearing, in front of the Water Commission, in public—" He paused. "It's enough to raise serious questions that can't be quietly dismissed. It's enough to start an official inquiry." "That's what we need," she said. "Not a conviction. An inquiry." Seth nodded slowly. "The Water Commission meeting," he said. "Blackwell requested agenda time," she said. "I need to be there." He was quiet for a moment. "Eliza, the Water Commission it's not a friendly room. Blackwell has relationships with those commissioners. He's been cultivating them for years. There are going to be ranchers there, lawyers, county officials. And you're going to walk in as who?" she said steadily. He met her eyes and had the decency not to flinch. "As someone they don't know," he said. "Someone they haven't taken seriously yet." "Good," she said. "That's what I need." Vincent Blackwell arrived in Copper Creek on a Wednesday, which was 2 days before the Water Commission meeting, which told Eliza something about how seriously he took the commission itself. Not very, but enough to arrive early and work the room. She did not go to town those 2 days. She stayed at the ranch and worked, and she sent Miles to observe, because Miles could walk through a room without being noticed in the way that some people have, a quality of existing at the edge of other people's attention. What Miles brought back, both evenings, was useful. Blackwell had taken his meals at the best table in the saloon's dining room both nights, with different company each time. The first night, 2 of the county commissioners. The second night, a lawyer from Billings that Miles didn't recognize, and a man Eliza identified from the description as almost certainly the Sutter whose name Pruitt had dropped. He was, by all accounts, a composed man, well-dressed without being showy, polite, slow to raise his voice. He had money manners, the kind of ease that comes from never having had to wonder whether you'd be welcome somewhere. "He asked about you again," Miles said on the second evening report. "I overheard part of it. He knows your name." Eliza was silent. It wasn't threatening," Miles said carefully. "More like curious. He said, 'Who is this woman Thornton? What does she actually do out there?' His lawyer said something about household staff." Miles paused. Blackwell said probably, but worth knowing. He's smart, Eliza said. Yes, Miles said. Smart enough to get this far, she said. Not smart enough to look at a woman sitting on a bench outside the post office and see anything other than what he expected to see. Miles was quiet for a moment. Be careful with that, he said. She looked at him. Underestimating the people who underestimate you, he said. It's useful, but it can make you overconfident. He said it without any particular edge, just Miles observing a thing and saying it plainly. He's been careful for a long time. If he gets a sense that something is off, he'll move fast. She held his gaze. I know, she said. You're right. She turned back to her desk. I'll be ready. The day before the hearing, Gideon found her in the office at near midnight. She had not come to bed. She had not been to bed before 1 a.m. in 10 days. And he appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the look of a man who has decided to do something he's been working up to for a while. He set 1 cup in front of her. He sat down across the desk. What do you need tomorrow? He said. She looked up from the document she was collating into the packet she would bring to the hearing. I need you and your brothers to be there, all 5 of you. And I need Walt Henderson to come if Miles can reach him tonight. He's seen the pattern in his own books, and he's a respected voice in that room. I already talked to Miles, Gideon said. Walt's coming. Agnes Potter wants to come too. Something moved in Eliza's chest at the name. Agnes Potter, who had cried. Good, she said. That's good. He wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at her for a moment in the way he sometimes did. Not uncomfortable, but considering something. Can I ask you something? Yes. You've been at this for 5 weeks, he said. You came here with a bag and a few coins and no reason to trust any of us. Why are you still doing this? Not the work. I mean, this level of it. You could have found the theft, told me, and let me handle it from there. It would have been enough, more than enough. He paused. But you didn't stop. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the papers in front of her, the Renner entries, the Meridian filing, the chain that led from a paper company in Billings to Agnes Potter crying at her kitchen table, believing she'd failed. I've been in that position, she said, where something was taken from you and you spent years thinking it was your own fault, your own failure. She didn't look up. It's a particular kind of weight. It changes how you carry yourself, how much you believe you deserve. It changes the size of your life. She paused. If there's something I can do to take that weight off of somebody else, not give it to them in the first place, I'm going to do it, that's all. Gideon was quiet for a long time. Something was taken from you, he said. It wasn't a question. I think so, she said. I'm not sure yet, but I think so. He didn't push it. She had always appreciated that about him, the way he knew when a thing had been said as completely as it was going to be said, and held still with it. We'll be there tomorrow, he said. All of us. She nodded. He got up to leave. At the door, he stopped. Eliza. He turned around. Whatever happens tomorrow, you know you have a place here. That's not conditional on what happens at that meeting. She looked at him across the room in the lamplight with the late-night quiet of the ranch house around them. She felt the thing she always felt when someone said something like that, the immediate, involuntary flinching, the protective reflex of a person who has learned that places described as permanent have a way of not being. She felt it, and then she felt something else underneath it, something that had been growing quietly for 5 weeks without her quite noticing. I know, she said. She wasn't completely sure it was true, but she said it, and she let herself say it, and she turned back to her desk and kept working. The morning of the hearing was clear. The sky, the hard, flat blue of early autumn in Montana. The kind of sky that makes everything look sharp-edged and serious. Eliza dressed carefully, not because she had anything impressive to wear, but because care itself meant something, the difference between a woman who is being serious and a woman who is performing seriousness. She put on her best dress, which was clean and pressed and had no tears. She pinned her hair up firmly. She packed her document packet twice, checking the order of each item, making sure every page was where she needed it. She came downstairs to find all 4 brothers in the kitchen, already dressed, already eating. Danner, miraculously, was on time. Seth had a folder of his own. Legal notes, the filing records, backup documentation. Miles was standing by the window in the way he stood when he was preparing himself for something. Caleb looked at her when she came in and said, without preamble, "You ready?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "Eat something first." She ate. It was not easy. Her stomach was doing the particular thing it did before confrontations, the tight, rolling unease of a body that knows something significant is about to happen and is running through its options. She ate anyway, because Miles had been right about overconfidence, and you couldn't afford anything less than fully functional. They drove to town in 2 wagons, Walt Henderson and Agnes Potter joining them at the edge of town. Agnes Potter was a small, stiff-backed woman in her 60s with white hair and a face that had been weathered by decades of outdoor work into something you'd describe as formidable. She sat beside Eliza in the wagon and looked at the packet in Eliza's hands and said, "Is it enough?" "I believe so," Eliza said. Agnes Potter looked at her steadily. "My husband built that land," she said. "He built it from nothing. 2 years ago, I thought I'd watched us lose it through our own stupidity, and I've been carrying that." She looked forward. "If you can show it wasn't that—" "I can show it wasn't that," Eliza said. Not gently, not soft-pedaling it for comfort, but plainly, the way she'd learned the Potters needed things said. Agnes nodded and said nothing else. The County Water Commission met in the town hall, a 2-story building on the east side of Main Street that was the largest indoor space in Copper Creek and was used, on alternate weeks, as a public meeting room and a storage facility for things nobody wanted to deal with. Today it had been arranged in meeting configuration, a long table at the front for the commissioners, rows of chairs behind it for the public, and a standing space along the walls for the overflow crowd that had apparently heard, through the fast and thorough information network of a small town, that something unusual was happening at the monthly water meeting. Eliza walked in and took stock immediately. 3 commissioners at the front table, 2 she didn't know and one whose name Seth had given her, a man named Orfield, who had been on the commission for 6 years and had, according to the county records, voted in favor of Blackwell's previous water access requests on 2 separate occasions. Lawyers along the left wall, several of them. Ranching families in the chairs, more than she'd expected. Word had traveled. And at the far right of the front table, in a chair slightly apart from the commissioner's table, but clearly positioned to be heard, Vincent Blackwell. She saw him for the first time and understood why he was dangerous. He was not what she had imagined, which was the first useful piece of information. She had, without meaning to, built an image in her mind of someone who looked like what he was, calculating, acquisitive, patient in a cold way. Instead, he was an unremarkable-looking man in his late 50s, medium height, with a plain face and mild eyes, and the air of someone whose most important quality was that you consistently underestimated him. He was dressed well, but not flashily. He was talking quietly to the man next to him, and he laughed at something. A real laugh, small and genuine-looking. And she thought, that is the most dangerous thing about him. He looks like he means it. He glanced up as she entered and their eyes met briefly, and then his moved on with the flat lack of recognition of someone who has categorized a person and filed them in the wrong drawer. Good, she thought. Keep it there. The Cross brothers filed in behind her, and Henderson and Agnes Potter, and the room shifted in the small cellular way. Rooms shift when a critical mass of people who mean business arrive together. Gideon sat beside her. He did not say anything. She opened her packet and smoothed the first page. Commissioner Orfield called the meeting to order and moved through the routine items with the brisk efficiency of a man who has a specific item later on the agenda and wants to get there. Eliza listened to every word. She watched Blackwell from the side of her field of vision, cataloging his reactions, noting the moment when his lawyer leaned in and said something that made him glance, briefly and with a different quality than before, toward the Cross family's cluster. He'd noticed Gideon. He hadn't noticed what Gideon was sitting next to. Orfield reached item 7, the unspecified matter of regional water access, requested by V. Blackwell. Blackwell stood. He spoke with the practiced ease of a man who has done this many times, laid out a proposal to formalize and consolidate water access management in the Copper Creek Valley under a regional water authority, which would ensure equitable distribution during drought periods, he said. Several heads in the room nodded. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like exactly the kind of sensible, forward-thinking management that a community under periodic drought stress should want. Orfield nodded. Is there discussion? Gideon's hand went up. Orfield looked at him. Looked, Eliza thought, slightly wary. Mr. Cross, I'd like to raise some concerns about this proposal, Gideon said. And I'd like to ask permission for the woman at my side, Eliza Thornton, to present information relevant to the Commission's consideration of it. The room did something, not a sound exactly, a movement of attention, a collective refocusing. Blackwell's expression remained mild, but his lawyer looked at Eliza with a new quality of assessment. Orfield hesitated, the hesitation of a man checking an internal calculation. Concerns of what nature? Financial misconduct, fraud, and the forgery of water rights documentation, Gideon said. He said it quietly and clearly, and the room went completely still. Eliza stood up. Her legs were steady. Her hands were steady. She had the document packet in her left hand, and she looked at the three commissioners, and then at the room full of people who had, most of them, never had cause to take her seriously, and she thought of Agnes Potter sitting ramrod straight in her chair, and she thought of 4 years of someone taking money from people who worked themselves to the bone, and she drew a breath that went all the way down. Thank you, she said. Her voice was clear. I'll try to be concise. And she began. She started with the smallest number, $7.60. She held up the first ledger page, the original Renner entry, the one from 4 years back with the unfamiliar signature beneath it, and she read the amount aloud into the quiet room. She said the date. She said the supplier name. She said what the charge was listed for, sundry equipment maintenance. Then she put that page down and held up the next one. Same supplier. 6 weeks later. Different amount, same category, same vague description. And the next. And the next. 12 entries across 4 years, each one modest, each one just below the threshold that would have required a second signature. She laid them in a line on the commissioner's table as she spoke, and she watched the room follow her hands, watched the pattern become visible in the physical space between the documents. Renner and Associates, she said, registered in Billings, 1883, through the law firm of Harwick and Sons. Principal listed as P.C. Renner. Postal box only. No physical address. No record of any work performed at the Cross Ranch or anywhere else in this county. She paused. $341 over 4 years for services that were never rendered. The room was quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when information lands. Not stunned silence, working silence, the kind where people are following and calculating and connecting. Blackwell's lawyer was on his feet. His name was Fenn, and he had the smooth, preemptive quality of a man who has interrupted proceedings before and knows the exact tone to use. Commissioner Orfield, I'm not sure what the relevance of a private accounting matter. Sit down, Mr. Fenn, Orfield said. He said it with a flatness that surprised Eliza, a flatness that suggested Orfield was, whatever his prior relationships with Blackwell, a man who did not like being played in front of a room full of his neighbors. You'll have time. Fenn sat. Blackwell had not moved. He was watching Eliza with an expression she could not entirely read. It was not the mild dismissal of before, but it was not alarm either. It was the expression of a man recalculating something. She moved to the second thread. The feed discrepancies. She explained the mechanism clearly, without jargon, the way she'd learned to explain accounting problems to people who weren't accountants. Rounding errors, she said, each one small. The kind of thing a busy rancher looking at a full ledger at the end of a long day would skip right past. She had a column she'd prepared. The stated amounts, the actual amounts, the difference. She put that in front of Commissioner Voss, the youngest of the three, who was leaning forward and had been leaning forward since she began. Then she held up the intercepted letter. This is a notification from the Hartley Land Survey Company, addressed to Gideon Cross, dated March of 1886. She set it on the table. It confirms that the Cross Ranch's eastern water easement, registered in 1871, was reviewed and validated in the county's most recent land survey. Routine notification. No action required. She paused. It was never opened by its recipient. The envelope was slit and replaced in a stack of office correspondence, face down. 3 months after this letter was written, the Cross family received a separate communication, through different channels, suggesting that their eastern easement was under legal review and of uncertain status. They spent the following year and a significant amount of money in legal consultations confirming rights they had always clearly held. Orfield looked at the letter. He looked at Gideon. You never saw this? No, Gideon said. Not until 5 weeks ago. Who had access to your office correspondence? Family, ranch hands, and a part-time bookkeeper named Aldous Pruitt, Gideon said. He kept his voice even, but Eliza heard what it cost him, the specific discomfort of naming someone who'd sat in his house. In the third row, she saw a man go rigid and then very still. She did not look directly at him. She did not need to. She moved to the Meridian documents. This was where Fenn tried again. He was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence that introduced Meridian Land and Water Company. Commissioner, these are corporate documents from a wholly separate jurisdiction and have no bearing. They have direct bearing, Seth said from behind her. He stood up without asking. I have a certified copy of the Helena corporate filing listing Meridian Land and Water Company's principal shareholders. Mr. Blackwell's name appears as the majority shareholder. That's not an allegation. It's a public record. He held the document up, walked to the commissioner's table, and set it down with the precise deliberateness of a man who has been waiting for this moment and intends to get it right. Harwick and Sons, the legal firm that registered Renner and Associates, the ghost company draining funds from the Cross Ranch, also registered 3 other holding companies with direct ties to Meridian, including Blue Ridge Land, which filed the adverse claims that cost Agnes Potter 2 pasture parcels in the last 18 months. The room moved again, and this time it wasn't just the working silence. It was something louder, something with friction in it. Agnes Potter sat very straight in her chair. Walt Henderson put his hands flat on his knees and looked at the ceiling and then back at the front table with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. Blackwell's lawyer was on his feet again, and this time his voice had lost some of its smoothness. These are conjecture and speculation. A shareholder connection does not constitute. It constitutes a starting point, Commissioner Voss said, cutting him off. Voss was 38 years old and had been a farmer before he was a commissioner, and he had the farmer's habit of looking at a thing and saying what it was. He looked at Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell, I'd like to hear your response, directly, not through counsel. Blackwell stood. He was still composed. She had to give him that. He had the quality of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and understands that the worst thing you can do is let the room see you sweat. The corporate connections Ms. Thornton describes are accurate in their narrow, technical sense, he said. His voice was measured, reasonable. Meridian is a holding company in which I am invested, yes, but investment is not direction. I have no operational knowledge of the subsidiary activities of every company in which I hold shares. The suggestion that I have orchestrated any kind of campaign against neighboring ranch families is, he spread his hand slightly. I think it speaks for itself as an accusation. He was good. She had known he would be good. She waited until he sat down. Then she said, I have one more document. The room was very quiet. She reached into the packet and withdrew a single page, a copy she'd made herself, painstakingly, of a letter she'd found in the Cross Ranch correspondence files, buried under 2 years of accumulated paper, folded 3 times, and tucked into the back of a ledger that had been set on the wrong shelf. It was a letter from Harwick and Sons to an unnamed party, using coded language that had become clear to her only in context, referring to the northern property and the access matter and the timeline for resolution. But it was dated, and it was signed, and the signature at the bottom was not P.C. Renner, and it was not a partner at Harwick and Sons. It was Vincent Blackwell. She held it up. This is a letter found in the Cross Ranch's own files, she said. It was, I believe, placed there by mistake, possibly when the office was accessed to intercept the survey notification letter. It's addressed from Mr. Blackwell personally to the Harwick firm and references, in his own language, the management of what he calls the northern property situation, and ensuring the access question remains unresolved through the upcoming county review period. She set it on the table. This is not a shareholder removed from operational decisions. This is the principal, directing the operation. The silence that followed was a different animal entirely from anything that had come before it. Ben was on his feet, and this time the smoothness was gone completely. That document has not been authenticated. The chain of custody is documented, Eliza said. I can provide a written account of where and how it was found, signed by myself and 2 other witnesses who can confirm the filing location. But I would also point out that Mr. Blackwell has not denied the signature. She looked at Blackwell directly. Would you like to? The room turned to look at him. Blackwell sat still for a moment that was slightly too long. Then he said quietly, I'd like to review the document before making any statement about it. Of course, she said. The commissioners have the original. Commissioner Orfield was already reading it. He passed it to Voss. The third commissioner, a taciturn man named Galt, who had said nothing through the entire proceeding, read it twice and then set it down on the table very carefully, as if it might do something. What happened next was not dramatic, in the way that films later would make these moments dramatic. It was messy and loud and overlapping. Fenn demanded a recess. Orfield denied it. Two ranchers in the back rows began arguing with each other. Not opposing each other, Eliza realized after a moment, but both of them angry and both of them processing the same information in different ways, and the noise of it spilling into something uncontrolled. Agnes Potter stood up without being acknowledged and said, in a voice that cut through the noise with the precision of someone who has been waiting a very long time to say something, My husband's land. I want to know about my husband's land. Orfield had to call for order twice, then a third time. In the middle of it, Eliza sat down. She had been standing for 45 minutes, and her legs were shaking. Not from fear, she thought, but from the physical effort of standing still while being watched by 100 people, and from the release of tension that comes when you have done the thing you spent weeks preparing to do, and you are now on the other side of it, and the outcome is no longer in your hands. Gideon leaned toward her. You all right? He said, low. Yes, she said. It was mostly true. Caleb, on her other side, said nothing. He just shifted in his chair so that his shoulder was closer to hers, which was Caleb's version of everything he couldn't say out loud. It took another 2 hours. Orfield called a formal recess, and in the recess, Fenn and Blackwell retreated to a corner with two other men Eliza didn't recognize, and there was an intense, quiet conversation during which Blackwell looked at Eliza once, with an expression that was the first genuinely unguarded thing she'd seen from him. Not anger, not contempt, but the specific expression of a man confronting the fact that he has lost a thing he thought was safe. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, not because she was intimidated, but because she didn't need the moment. She'd already had the moments that mattered. When the commission reconvened, Orfield read a prepared statement in the careful language of institutional caution. The Renner charges would be referred for a formal county fraud inquiry. The Meridian-Harwick connection would be reviewed by the state attorney's office. The adverse claims against the Potter parcels were suspended pending investigation. Blackwell's water access proposal was tabled indefinitely. He said it all in the measured, slightly flat tone of a man saying more than the words contain, which Eliza translated as, this is real, this is going somewhere, and everyone in this room knows it. The room erupted, not in celebration. It wasn't that clean. It was the eruption of a room full of people who have been carrying individual weights and have just discovered those weights are connected, and the feeling is some compound of anger and relief, and the particular vertigo of understanding that your private struggle was not private at all. Walt Henderson was on his feet and talking to the commissioner at a speed that suggested he'd been saving up things to say. Two other ranchers she didn't know were comparing notes with the urgency of people who have just recognized each other. Agnes Potter sat very still in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and tears were running down her face in a quiet, steady way that she was not doing anything to stop or hide. And Eliza looked at her and looked away because the sight of it did something to her chest that she wasn't ready to deal with in this room. Outside the town hall, in the sharp autumn air, the Cross brothers stood in a rough cluster, and nobody said anything for a full minute. The sounds of the meeting continuing inside drifted out in waves, voices, Orfield calling for order again, a burst of something too muffled to identify. Danner broke the silence, which was appropriate because Danner was constitutionally unable to sustain silence longer than about 90 seconds. That was... He stopped, tried again. I don't have the word for it. Don't need a word, Caleb said. She took him apart, Danner said in front of the whole county, with paper. With paper she organized herself, Seth said, and there was something in his voice that was close to wonder, which wasn't an emotion Seth deployed casually. Miles said nothing, but he was looking at Eliza in the particular way he had when he was noting something for permanent retention. Gideon stood slightly apart from his brothers, looking at the street, and Eliza stood beside him because she wasn't sure yet where to stand, and beside him had become, over the past weeks, the place that felt most natural. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was looking at the town, the same street she'd walked down 2 months ago with a canvas sack and a few coins, and Agnes Mercer's door closing in her ears. "It's not over," she said. "The inquiry will take time. Blackwell has lawyers and money, and he's going to use both." "I know," Gideon said. "The Potter land might take months to fully restore. The fraud investigation could drag." "I know, Eliza." She stopped. He turned to look at her, and he had that expression he sometimes had, the one that said he was about to say something he hadn't said before and had decided it was time. "You did what you set out to do," he said. "Today. You did it exactly. Whatever comes after, the legal process, the timeline, that's going to go the way it goes. But you walked in there and you put the truth in front of people who needed to see it, and you didn't flinch." He paused. "I've never seen anything like it." She wanted to say something deflecting, to say it was just the documents, just the work, just what the numbers showed. The deflection was ready. She'd used it so many times it came automatically, the reflex of someone who learned young that claiming credit was dangerous, that taking up space was dangerous, that being seen was a risk. She did not use it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. They stood together for another moment, and then Seth called something from behind them. Something about finding somewhere to eat because he hadn't had lunch. And the moment dissolved into the ordinary business of people who have been through something and are now returning to the world. The first shift came from Agnes Mercer, which was both predictable and not. It was 2 days after the hearing. Eliza was in the hardware store picking up a supply order that Caleb had asked her to collect, when Agnes Mercer came in for something, thread, of all things, a simple domestic errand, and they ended up standing at the same counter at the same time. Agnes looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at Agnes. For a moment she thought Agnes was going to simply turn and find something else to do until Eliza left. The woman had the posture of someone strongly considering it, but she didn't. "I heard about the hearing," Agnes said. She said it to a point just past Eliza's shoulder, which was the only concession she was apparently willing to make to the fact that directness was uncomfortable. "Everyone heard." "I imagine so," Eliza said. A pause. Agnes turned the spool of thread in her hands. "The Potters," she said. "James Potter built that property himself." "Yes," Eliza said. "Worked 60-hour weeks for 30 years. "I know." Another pause. Longer. Whatever Agnes Mercer was working through, she was working through it slowly and with visible effort, the way people work through things that require them to have been wrong about something. "I told the women at the church quilting circle," Agnes said finally, "that you seem to be a capable person, in the context of the hearing." She said it with the slight aggressive clipping of someone who has gone as far as they intend to go and has communicated that clearly. Eliza looked at her. She had a choice here. She could be gracious in a way that cost Agnes nothing, or she could be honest in a way that cost Agnes something but was worth saying. She picked up her supply order. "Thank you, Mrs. Mercer," she said. Not warmly, but without hostility either. Just the plain acknowledgement of one person to another. Agnes nodded, once, and they went their separate directions. It was not a reconciliation. It was not a lesson learned. It was a small, imperfect, deeply human shift of 2 degrees. The kind of change that happens not because someone becomes a different person, but because reality has pressed against their assumptions hard enough that the assumptions had to move a little to make room. Eliza had learned to take what was real over what was satisfying every time. The other ranching families were different, more open, less complicated. Walt Henderson brought his account books to the ranch 4 days after the hearing, sat at the kitchen table with Eliza and Seth for 3 hours, and they found 2 years of meridian-connected draining in his own records, carefully disguised under a different shell company name, but using the same mechanism. He was a big, weathered man who had spoken at the hearing, briefly and clearly, and who now sat at the table with the particular stillness of someone who has been angry for a long time and is only now understanding what at. When they finished, he sat back and pressed his hands over his face for a moment, just a moment, and then put them flat on the table. "How do you thank someone for this?" he said. "You don't have to," Eliza said. "I know I don't have to." She thought about it. Tell people the truth, she said. When someone asks what happened, tell them what actually happened. Don't let it get softened into something comfortable. He looked at her. I can do that, he said. The inquiry moved faster than anyone expected, partly because Orfield, whatever his prior relationship with Blackwell, turned out to be a man who did not like being made to look complicit in front of his community, and partly because the state attorney's office, once they received the initial filing, sent their own investigator who arrived in Copper Creek within 2 weeks and began pulling the Meridian threads independently. Aldous Pruitt, faced with the evidence of his own involvement and the serious demeanor of a state investigator, made the calculation that a great many small men make when the larger operation they've been serving suddenly becomes a liability. He cooperated fully and quickly in exchange for considerations that would come later. What Pruitt provided was not just confirmation of what Eliza already knew. He provided the operations detail. The names of the Harwick partners who'd managed the day-to-day filing work, the schedule of payments to Sutter, the explicit instructions that had come from Blackwell's personal correspondence regarding which properties to target and in what order, and the broader timeline of the plan, which had been running not for 4 years but for 7, across a wider geography than even Eliza had suspected. And he provided one more thing. He mentioned, in the context of explaining how the operations had first been set up, a set of fraudulent land proceedings from the late 1870s that had been among the first test cases for the network. Earlier work, messier, less refined. One of the properties involved was a family farm in eastern Montana, south of Billings. A property that had been taken through a combination of forged debt documentation and manufactured tax arrears, processed so quickly through a corrupt county clerk that the family had almost no time to mount a legal response. The family name in Pruitt's account was Thornton. Seth brought the document to Eliza. He found her in the office, where else, at about 7 in the evening, and he came in and closed the door and sat down across from her, which was the thing he did when he was about to say something that required the door to be closed. He set the transcript of Pruitt's statement on the desk. He had it open to the relevant page, which he had marked with a folded corner. She read it. She read it twice. She set it down on the desk in front of her and put her hands in her lap and sat very still for a moment, looking at the middle distance. Seth said nothing. He had the sense not to talk. Her family's farm. The one she'd grown up on. The one she'd kept the books for from age 14. The one that had been taken when she was 22 in proceedings that happened so fast and were documented so thoroughly that she'd spent years believing, the way Agnes Potter had believed, that it was somehow her own fault. That she'd missed something, failed to catch something, been inadequate in some way she couldn't fully name. She had not failed. The documentation had been manufactured. The debt instruments had been forged. The tax arrears had been fabricated by a county clerk who was later, she would find out, paid through a different shell company connected to the same network. They had taken her home, and they had taken it so cleanly, so thoroughly, and made it look so much like ordinary failure that she had carried the weight of it as her own for 8 years. She sat with that for a long time. Seth waited. When she finally looked up, her eyes were dry. Not because she wasn't feeling it, she was feeling it enormously in a way that was going to take a long time to fully arrive. But because the thing she was feeling was too large for the ordinary expressions of it, too complicated, too many layers of anger and grief, and something that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. The particular sensation of a burden whose weight you've been carrying so long you've stopped noticing it, lifting. The property, she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. Is there a record of where it went, after the proceedings? Seth nodded. He had already looked. It was absorbed into a larger land holding that was later sold on, he said. It's gone through 2 transactions since then. The original fraudulent claim. That's what the inquiry can address. Restitution is, he paused. It's complicated. The land itself is probably not recoverable. But the financial claim against the network, I don't care about the land, she said. He stopped. She looked at the transcript on her desk. I mean, I care. But that's not the part that matters. She pressed her hands flat on the table, the way she always did when she was grounding herself in something real. I've spent 8 years thinking I lost that farm because I wasn't good enough, she said. That's the part that matters, knowing it wasn't that. She paused. The rest is legal process. Seth nodded slowly. For what it's worth, he said, you were always good enough. She looked at him. Seth, who had been the most skeptical of her at the beginning, who had asked the pointed questions and watched her with the careful eyes of someone who'd been disappointed before. She looked at him and understood that he meant it, not as a performance of comfort, but as a statement from a man who is careful with his statements. I know, she said, and for the first time in 8 years she meant it without qualification. He picked up the transcript and stood to go. At the door he stopped. Gideon should know, he said, about your family's farm. I'll tell him, she said. Tonight? She thought about it. Yes, she said. Tonight. She told him on the porch after supper. When the evening had gone, that particular dark blue that comes before full dark, and the stars were starting over the northern ridge. She told him without making it smaller than it was, without the deflection she would have used a month ago. She told him what Pruitt had said and what it meant, and how long she'd been carrying the weight of a failure that was not a failure. He listened to all of it. When she finished, there was a silence that wasn't uncomfortable but was full. The kind of silence that sits between people who have said something real and are letting it be real for a moment before anything else. You knew, he said finally, not accusatory, when you were looking at the records, that something similar might have happened to your family. I suspected, she said. I wasn't sure until tonight. You could have said, I didn't want it to change how you looked at what I was doing, she said. Whether it was personal or professional, I needed it to be both, and I needed it to be treated as professional. He was quiet. It was always both, he said. I know that now. Another silence. A horse shifted in the barn. Somewhere down the road, a coyote called once and then stopped. Your farm, he said. What do you want to do about it? Let the inquiry do what it does, she said. Work with the state attorney, document what I can. The financial claim is real even if the land is gone. She paused. I spent a lot of years running, she said. Running away from it mostly. I didn't understand that I was running away from something that had been done to me. She looked at the night sky over the ridge. I don't want to run anymore. He turned to look at her. She could see his face in the fading light, the square jaw and the controlled expression, and underneath it, something that had been there for a while and was not hidden anymore. Then don't, he said. It was a simple thing to say. It was not a promise. He was too careful a person for promises that hadn't been earned. But it was an opening plainly offered. She sat with it. She sat with the weight of 8 years and the absence of it, with the ranch behind them settling into its evening sounds, with the fact that she was here and not running, and for the first time in a very long time, the two things felt like they might be the same thing. Gideon, she said. Yeah. I'm tired. He nodded. Go to bed. I mean, she paused, looking for the right words and finding, unusually, that they were simple. I'm tired of living like I'm about to leave. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, Okay. She went inside. She went up to her room, the one with the faded blue curtains and the desk under the window and the view of the corrals, and she sat on the bed's edge in the dark, not ready to sleep yet, just sitting with what the day had been. Outside, the stars were very clear. The autumn air came through the window gap, cold now at night, carrying the smell of dry grass and turning leaves and something mineral underneath, the particular smell of this particular piece of Montana that she had come to know without meaning to, the way you come to know a place when you stop moving through it and start living in it. She lay back on the bed, fully dressed, and looked at the ceiling. For the first time in 8 years, she did not calculate her exits. The inquiry did not move cleanly. Nothing about it did. There were weeks in October and November where it seemed to stall entirely. Blackwell's lawyers filed motions, requested extensions, challenged the admissibility of documents, disputed the chain of custody on the intercepted letter, and generally did what expensive lawyers do when their client is cornered and the objective shifts from winning to surviving. There were days when Seth came back from the county recorder's office looking like a man who had been fighting through wet concrete, and Eliza had to read the same paragraph of a legal response 3 times before the words stopped rearranging themselves, and Gideon would find some physical task to throw himself into, because the waiting was its own kind of punishment for a man built toward action. It was not a clean victory. It was a long, grinding, imperfect process, And anyone who tells a story like this and skips that part is lying to you. But it moved. Slowly and unevenly, the way real things move, it moved. The state attorney's investigator, a compact, unsmiling woman named Ruth Calder, who had the manner of someone who has seen every variety of human dishonesty and is neither shocked nor distracted by any of it, spent 6 weeks in Copper Creek. She interviewed Prewitt 3 separate times. She pulled the Harwick firm's Montana filing records going back to 1876. She identified 7 ranch properties in 3 counties that had been targeted through the Meridian Network, 4 of which had lost land through proceedings that could now be reconstructed as fraudulent. She built the kind of case that doesn't depend on a single dramatic document, but on the accumulated interlocking weight of 100 small records that all tell the same story from different angles. She came to the ranch twice. Both times she sat across from Eliza at the kitchen table and asked precise questions in a precise order, and Eliza answered them the same way. On the second visit, at the end of 2 hours of questions, Calder closed her notebook and looked at Eliza with the first non-professional expression she'd shown. "You organized this material," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Eliza said, "from scratch, in 5 weeks." "More or less." Calder was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing this for 12 years, she said. "I've seen fraud cases built by teams of people with official authority and institutional resources that weren't this clean." She picked up her notebook. "That's not a compliment exactly. It's an observation." "I'll take it," Eliza said. Calder almost smiled. "You'll be a primary witness," she said. "When this goes to formal proceedings, it'll be unpleasant. His lawyers will try to characterize you as... They'll try different things. None of them will be kind." "I know," Eliza said. "You're not worried?" Eliza thought about the bench outside the post office, the canvas sack, the sound of Agnes Mercer's latch. She thought about 8 years of believing a story that someone else had written about her, in a ledger she'd never been allowed to read. "I've already been characterized plenty of things," she said. "It didn't stop me before." Calder nodded. She stood to leave. "Miss Thornton," she said at the door. "The Thornton property. The original farm. I want to be honest with you about the realistic outcome. The land itself passed through 2 legitimate subsequent transactions after the fraudulent seizure. Unwinding that is, it's legally very complicated, and the people who currently hold it are not connected to the fraud. They bought in good faith." "I know," Eliza said. "I'm not expecting the land." "The financial restitution claim is strong," Calder said. "That I can pursue." "Then pursue it," Eliza said. "That's enough." It was not entirely enough. She was honest with herself about that. In the private hours, in the dark of her room. There is a particular grief for a lost place that financial restitution cannot touch. The farm had been her father's hands in the soil, and her mother's kitchen in the mornings, and the specific smell of the barn in winter and the field where she'd learned, at age 14, to run a set of books. Money doesn't buy those things back. It never does. You carry the grief for the place, the irreducible specific loss of it, and you put it somewhere inside you that you can visit without being destroyed by it, and you keep going. She was learning to do that. It was not something you finish learning. Blackwell's formal charges were filed in December. They named him directly, not through Meridian, not through Harwick, but by name, as principal architect of a fraudulent land and water acquisition scheme operating across 3 Montana counties over 7 years. The charges included fraud, forgery of official documents, conspiracy to deprive landowners of property rights, and 2 counts relating specifically to the manufactured legal proceedings against the Potter and Henderson properties. He did not come back to Copper Creek after the hearing. His lawyers operated out of Billings. He was, by all accounts, Eliza received through Seth and Calder, a man in the process of discovering how far money could go when the facts were sufficiently well documented, and the answer was, not as far as he'd relied on. Sutter, the land agent, was charged separately. 2 partners at Harwick and Sons resigned their registrations and cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced exposure. Prewitt received a formal censure and was barred from working as an accountant in the state of Montana, which was, Eliza thought, a sentence that fit the crime in a poetic sort of way. The Potter parcels were restored in February, after a county commission ruling that the adverse claims had been fraudulently filed, and were therefore void from inception. Agnes Potter received the notification by mail. She came to the Cross Ranch 2 days later, unannounced, driving her own small wagon, and knocked on the front door. When Eliza answered it, Agnes Potter looked at her for a moment, this small, stiff-backed woman with the weathered face and the white hair. And then she did something unexpected. She held out a jar of preserved plums. "I put these up in September," Agnes said. "I was going to keep them, but I think you should have them." Eliza took the jar. It was warm from the wagon, and the plums were dark and perfect in the glass. "Thank you, Mrs. Potter." "Agnes," she said, "after everything—" She stopped, started again. "My husband wants to come and thank you personally. I told him to give it a few weeks because you've probably had enough people at you." She looked past Eliza into the house, then back. "Have you?"
Yes, well,
a few more are all right," Eliza said. "Come in. I'll put coffee on." Agnes Potter came in and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Calder had asked her questions, where Walt Henderson had spread his account books, where the brothers ate supper every night in their noisy and imperfect way, and they drank coffee and talked for an hour. Not about the fraud, not about the hearing, but about things adjacent to those things, about what it means to work land for 30 years and feel it become part of you, about what it does to a person to think they've failed at something they gave their life to, about the specific quality of relief that isn't quite happiness, but is deeper than happiness. The relief of having a wrong thing named as wrong. "I kept thinking," Agnes said, wrapping both hands around her cup, "that James and I had just gotten old, lost our edge. Young people make mistakes from inexperience. Old people make them from the other direction. You stop double-checking the things you know how to do because you've done them so long." She looked at Eliza steadily. "But that wasn't it." "No," Eliza said. "It was never it," Agnes said. "They just made it look like it was." "That's the design of it," Eliza said. "Make it look like your own failure. That way you don't look for the source." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "You knew that," she said, "because it happened to you." Eliza looked at her coffee. "Yes." "Does it help?" Agnes said. "Knowing the truth of it?" Eliza thought about this honestly, the way the question deserved to be thought about. "Some things, yes," she said. "Some things, the grief for the place, that doesn't change. But the weight I was carrying that wasn't mine to carry." She paused. "That's lighter." "Yes, that's considerably lighter." Agnes nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "Then that's something." They were both quiet for a moment, and outside the window the February light was doing its thin, pale Montana winter thing, and somewhere in the barn Caleb was working on something with a hammer, the sound of it coming through in a steady rhythm, and the smell of coffee was in the kitchen, and Agnes Potter was sitting across from her with the plum jar on the table between them, and Eliza thought, this is a real moment. Not a perfect one, not a resolved one, just real. Just two women sitting with the truth of what had happened to them, in a warm kitchen, on a cold day. You have to learn to take those moments when they come. The Cross brothers gave her a formal place at the table in February too, though not in any official way, because they were not particularly official people. It happened the way most real things happen in that house, incrementally, without announcement, and then all at once. It started with her name on the ranch accounts. Gideon asked her in early January if she would take on the accounts formally and permanently, not as a temporary arrangement, not as the provisional help around the ranch it had started as, but as an official role with official wages, written into the ranch's operating papers. She said yes. Seth drafted the paperwork, which was brief and clear, and included a wage that was not extravagant but was genuinely fair. And Gideon signed it, and Eliza signed it, and that was that. Then Miles asked her, with the directness that was his natural mode, whether she intended to stay through spring, and when she said yes, he said good, and went back to whatever he'd been doing, and that was also that. Danner was the one who made it least complicated, paradoxically, because he simply stopped treating her arrival as a thing that needed to be processed and started treating her as a fixture, in the way that young men sometimes skip the formal adjustment and land directly in the normal. He argued with her once about the supply order. She had changed the feed supplier to get better pricing, and he had opinions about this. And they argued for 10 minutes in the kitchen, and then she showed him the numbers, and he said, "Fine, whatever, you're right." with the particular gracelessness of someone who doesn't like being wrong but prefers accuracy to winning, and afterward they ate supper side by side, and that felt, somehow, like the clearest signal of all. Caleb moved her bags. Not all of them. She didn't have many. But the canvas sack that she'd kept packed, out of the old habit of staying portable, the one she'd had ready by the door of her room since August, had been sitting in the corner of the hallway for 2 weeks after a night when she'd brought it down for some reason and left it there. One morning, she came downstairs and it wasn't in the hallway anymore. She found it that evening, empty, in the storage room off the kitchen, folded neatly and placed on a shelf with the other household bags. She stood looking at it for a moment. She went and found Caleb in the barn. He was working on a harness with the focused, methodical attention he gave to physical tasks. "You moved my bag," she said. He didn't look up. "It was in the hallway." "I know." "It was a tripping hazard." She looked at the side of his face. He kept his eyes on the harness. There was, very briefly, something around his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the vicinity of one. "Thank you," she said. "It was a tripping hazard," he said again, and went back to the harness, and she went back to the house. With Gideon, it was slower, and it was harder, and it was more. That was the only honest way to describe it. Slower, harder, more. Two people who have both spent years becoming very careful do not suddenly become careless with each other. They move at the pace that real trust requires, which is not a romantic pace or a convenient one, but it is the only pace that builds something that lasts. They had evenings on the porch. They had mornings where they were both up early, before the others, and drank coffee in the kitchen without speaking much, and it didn't need filling. They had the occasional argument about the accounts, once, where Eliza was right, and Gideon was resistant, and neither of them handled it particularly well, and they had to come back to it the next day and finish it properly. They had the specific texture of two people building something careful and provisional and important. In March, when the snow was still on the northern ridge but the yard was muddy with the first hints of thaw, Gideon came to find her in the office and stood in the doorway in a way that meant he had something to say that he'd been working up to. She put her pen down and looked at him. "You've been here 7 months," he said. 7.5, she said. He came in and sat down across from her, the same chair he'd used on the night she'd first laid out the evidence, and he put his hands on the desk. Not reaching for her, just occupying the space, the way he did when he was being deliberate about something. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it plainly because I think you've had enough of things being said sideways." "All right," she said. "Do you want to be here?" She looked at him. The question was simpler than she'd expected and more complicated than it sounded. He wasn't asking about the work. He wasn't asking about the accounts or the ranch operations or whether she intended to stay through another season. He was asking the underlying thing, the thing that hadn't been said directly, that had been present in kitchen mornings and porch evenings, and the moved bag and the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. She thought about what the honest answer was. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, fully, without flinching, following it to where it actually led. She had arrived in Copper Creek with nothing and no plans for anything beyond surviving the next day. She had not been looking for a home. She had not been looking for people. She had been looking for a bench to sit on while she recalculated, and what she'd found instead was 5 brothers who argued about fence posts, and a ranch with a theft problem, and an enemy she hadn't known she had, and a truth she'd spent 8 years running from. She had found Agnes Potter's plums in a jar, and Miles's quiet observations and Danner's reluctant capitulations, and Caleb moving a bag. She had found a desk under a window with faded blue curtains, and a view of the corrals and a piece of Montana that smelled like dry grass and mineral water, and in the evenings, wood smoke. She had found Gideon Cross, who had crossed a street because he hadn't forgotten which one he used to be. "Yes," she said, "I want to be here." He nodded slowly, and something in his face settled. The thing that had been held carefully against an uncertain answer, released now. "Good," he said. It was the same word he'd used in August, when she'd told him she'd cook. It meant the same thing now that it had meant then. Acknowledgement, acceptance, the simple welcome of a thing being what it should be. And it meant something more too, the extra weight of 7.5 months in it, the winter in it, the truth in it. She looked at his hands on the desk. She put her hand over his, once, briefly, and then picked her pen back up. "I have to finish the March ledger," she said. "I know," he said. But he didn't move for another minute, just sat there while she worked, and the afternoon light came through the window and the ranch made its sounds around them, and neither of them needed to say anything else. There is a thing that happens when people survive something together. Not the dramatic version of survival, not the sudden rescue or the single moment of courage, though those things matter too. The other kind of survival, the daily, grinding, imperfect work of holding something together when it keeps trying to come apart. The kind that doesn't make for clean stories, that has bad days inside the good ones, and unresolved edges, and people failing each other in small ways and coming back and trying again. That kind of survival builds something that the dramatic kind doesn't. Something quieter and more load-bearing, something you can actually live in. By spring, Eliza Thornton had that with 5 brothers on a ranch in Montana. It was not a perfect thing. They drove each other to distraction on a regular basis. Danner still had opinions. Caleb still had a temper. Seth still held himself slightly apart. And you had to learn to read him sideways. Miles still said nothing when nothing was what was needed, which was not always what you wanted from him. And Gideon was still a man who ran on controlled intensity and kept his interior life at a measured distance from the world. And that was sometimes lonely if you were the person closest to it. But they were real. They were her people, which is a thing that can happen even between people with no blood connecting them, if the circumstances are honest enough and the work is shared enough and enough seasons pass. The financial restitution from the Thornton farm fraud was settled in the courts the following summer. Not a large sum, but a real one, determined by a careful accounting of original property value minus the subsequent legitimate improvements. The check arrived by mail, and Eliza held it for a moment and then put it in the ranch's account, marked for the east fence line repairs that Caleb had been putting off for 2 years because the budget never quite stretched. Gideon, when she told him what she'd done with it, looked at her for a moment. "That was yours," he said. "I know," she said. "The ranch is mine, so is the fence." He didn't argue. Blackwell's formal trial moved slowly through the courts over the following 2 years. She testified twice, once in a preliminary hearing and once in the main proceedings. And Fenn, true to Calder's warning, tried several different approaches to her credibility. He questioned her credentials, her character, her presence at the ranch. And once, in a moment that she suspected he immediately regretted, her appearance. She answered every question directly and without apparent emotion, which was the most effective thing she could have done, and which was also simply the truth of how she felt, composed, clear, and not interested in performing distress for anyone. Blackwell was convicted on 4 counts. He was not destroyed entirely, men with that kind of money rarely are, but his land holdings in the Copper Creek Valley were seized as proceeds of fraud and redistributed through a county process that, imperfect as it was, returned 2 of the 4 seized ranch properties to their original families. The Meridian Network was dissolved. The Harwick firm closed its Montana office. Ruth Calder wrote a brief note to Eliza after the verdict, which said only, "well documented." She appreciated that more than a longer letter would have provided. Copper Creek itself changed in the way that small communities change after something that requires them to look at themselves, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, persistent ways. People who had been silent during the years of the fraud were not all comfortable with what their silence had meant. Some of them did something about it, some of them didn't. That is the truth of communities and of people. The capacity for change is real, and so is the resistance to it. And both of those things live in the same people at the same time. And the best you can do is make it slightly more expensive to look away. Agnes Mercer never quite apologized, but she stopped calling Eliza that woman and started calling her Miss Thornton, and eventually just Eliza. And once, in a moment that Eliza suspected neither of them ever mentioned to anyone, Agnes Mercer held the door of the dry goods store open for her without being asked. And when Eliza thanked her, Agnes looked at her briefly and nodded with something in her face that was as close as she was going to get. Eliza took it. You learn to take what is real. The ranch went well that spring and the summer after, the first full good year they'd had in 4 years. The accounts clean and the records straight and the finances building instead of slowly bleeding. Gideon bought 2 new sections of fencing. Caleb finally fixed the barn door that had been sticking since winter. Miles got a dog which everyone else pretended not to be charmed by, and all of them quietly were. Danner turned 23 in May and announced at the birthday supper that he thought they should look at expanding the south pasture, and when Eliza confirmed the numbers supported it, he looked across the table at her with the particular expression of a young man who has learned the value of things he couldn't have named a year ago. That look cost her something. Not painfully, but in the way things cost you when they matter. She looked down at her plate and let it pass. On a Thursday evening in late August, almost exactly a year from the day she'd walked into Copper Creek on a road already past accounting, Eliza sat on the porch of the Cross Ranch in the early dark and looked out at the valley. The land was dry again, as it was every late summer, the grass brown and the air thin and the smell of dust on everything, the drought cycle starting again the way it always does, patient and indifferent. She had a cup of coffee going cold in her hands and a list she'd been writing in her notebook. Supplies needed, a note on the feed contract renewal, a reminder to pull the cattle tallies before the end of the month. The ordinary weight of a working life. Gideon came out and sat in the other chair. They were quiet for a while, the way they were comfortable being quiet. The stars were coming out over the northern ridge, the first of them, and somewhere in the lower pasture the cattle were moving, slow sounds in the dark. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her in the specific way he had, not pressing, not performing concern, just actually looking. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at the valley for a moment. She thought about an honest answer, the way she thought about everything. "The road," she said finally. "The south road, coming in. I was thinking about walking in on it, this time last year." She paused. "I had stale bread in my sack." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You do?" "You told me back in September," he said. "You said you'd eaten the last of it that morning." She hadn't remembered telling him that. The fact that he had held on to it, quietly, without making anything of it, did something to her chest that she had learned by now to let happen without either running from it or making too much of it. "I keep expecting it to feel like something it doesn't feel like," she said. "I thought belonging somewhere would feel, I don't know, more finished, like an ending." "Does it?" he said. She thought about it honestly, about the imperfect brothers and the ordinary arguments and the unresolved parts and the grief she still carried for the farm, and about Calder's 2-sentence note and Agnes Potter's plums and the empty canvas sack on the shelf in the storage room. "It feels like a beginning," she said. "Still, it just feels like a beginning that's going to last." He nodded. "That's what they are," he said. "The good ones." She put her notebook away and held her coffee cup and looked at the valley going dark under the stars. And she was not happy in the simple sense. She was something more complicated and more durable than simple happiness. She was a woman who had been taken from, who had survived the taking, who had walked into a town with nothing and refused to disappear, who had found the truth and carried it into a room full of people who doubted her and set it down where it couldn't be ignored. She was a woman who had stopped running, not because someone saved her, that was not the story, but because she had done the work, every day, one ledger at a time, and the work had made a place for her, and she had chosen to stay in it. The stars came fully out over Montana. The ranch settled into its night sounds. Eliza Thornton sat on the porch of her home and let the evening be what it was. That was enough. That was everything.